The first things you notice about New Mexico are its vast landscapes and the wide-open glory of its skies. Then you hear the quiet. With an area of over 121,000 square miles and a population of just 2 million, New Mexico can seem like one of our loneliest states. But there's a lot more going on here than meets the eye or the ear. In New Mexico, past, present, and future rub shoulders every day. Bustling cities look to tomorrow, while movie makers looking for the next blockbuster keep the state's Wild West yesterdays alive. Modern Mexican-American culture thrives in a land settled by missionaries and conquistadors. Traditional native dwellings inspire architects to build futuristic homes called earthships. Old airships come to die, while rumors of spaceships lure curiosity seekers from around the world. Scientists listen for real aliens among the stars and do research that may shape our future. It's all in New Mexico, a deceptively quiet state where dreamers come to reach for the sky. New Mexico has all the quiet you'll ever need. And it's not just the kind of quiet you can hear. Out on the remote plains of San Augustine, the radio frequencies are pretty silent too. That's why a group of scientists came here back in 1980 when they were looking for a place to put this. A 230-ton tower with an 82-foot wide radar dish. The scientists wanted to use it and the radio silence of these remote plains to listen for faint signals from outer space. So faint, they knew that a single antenna wouldn't be able to do the job on its own. So they built 27 of the dishes to capture the data they were after. They call them the Very Large Array. The antennas are mounted on 39 miles of train tracks, so the researchers can move them around the desert floor in order to fine-tune their observation of signals that started their journey to this corner of New Mexico billions of years ago. In the 1997 film Contact, a scientist, played by Jodie Foster, came here to listen for extraterrestrial life. Researchers here haven't yet heard ET, but what they have learned so far has revolutionized our understanding of black holes and young stars, allowed scientists to trace complex gas motions at the center of our own Milky Way, and shown us the furthest edges of the universe. New state-of-the-art electronics and software will increase the array's sensitivity by a factor of 10, ensuring that astronomers can continue to search the skies and that this futuristic addition to New Mexico's ancient landscape will endure. Just as this jagged peak has endured for 30 million years. Back then, this New Mexican landmark was the molten core of an active volcano. The lava cooled, and time and wind began to scrape the rest of the volcano away. This tower of basalt is all that remains. The Navajo call it the Rock with Wings, after the legend of a great bird that was said to have first guided their ancestors to these lands. European American settlers renamed it Ship Rock in honor of its nautical silhouette and the way it seemed to move along the horizon. Today, people come from around the world to see it sail the desert and pay their respects to a seemingly eternal symbol of New Mexico's timeless beauty. But ever-changing places, like the nearby Bisti Badlands, are a part of that beauty too. Millions of years ago, this barren landscape in the high desert of northwestern New Mexico's San Juan Basin was a lush swamp roamed by dinosaurs. In the ages since, time, water, and wind have left their mark. Rock formations called hoodoos stand guard over an ever-shifting landscape. Vast deposits of fossils are some of the only clues that these desolate hills were once covered by a giant wetland. Now without water, the 40,000-acre Bisti Badlands is a tough place to survive. But don't get the idea that all of New Mexico is bone dry. In the north, the Rio Grande flows into this state from its headwaters in Colorado's San Juan Mountains, bringing green along with it. As the river flows south, its course is set by a unique geological feature that is literally splitting New Mexico in two. They call it the Rio Grande Rift. For millions of years, two plates of the Earth's crust have been pulling apart, leaving behind a cleft that runs the length of the state. With steep walls and a deep canyon, it's naturally engineered to carry life-giving water to New Mexico's dry southern desert. But before it reaches the south, the rift narrows. The Rio Grande must twist its way through a series of rapids, a perfect place for adventure seekers. Designated a wild and scenic river in 1968, this part of the Rio Grande draws crowds of whitewater rafters eager to test their skills. Called Orilla Verde, or Green Riverbank, this 6-mile stretch of rapids lies 800 feet below the rim of the gorge. Rafters navigate around the massive boulders that have come to rest in this riverbed. From above, it's possible to see how the Rio Grande's jagged path through the flat desert floor has created a stark, beautiful landscape. But the most breathtaking sight along this chasm may be human-made. Built in 1965 along U.S. Highway 64, the Rio Grande Gorge Bridge leaps across the rift 650 feet above the river, making it the second highest expansion bridge in the United States. Farther south, the cliffs fall away as the Rio Grande brings the gift of water to central New Mexico, just as it has for millions of years. The river hurries along on its eternal journey south, heading for the state's modern metropolis, Albuquerque. Home to the University of New Mexico and the heart of the state's economy, Albuquerque is New Mexico's largest city. 750,000 people, more than a third of the state's population, call this metropolitan area home. One reason this fast-growing city can survive is because of the giant aquifer that lies beneath it. Residents here don't have the water woes that plague other big cities in the Southwest. But that's not the case for most people in this bone-dry state. Which is why the waters of the Rio Grande are so precious. And why the government built this reservoir in 1916, close to 150 miles downriver from Albuquerque. Elephant Butte Dam is 300 feet tall. It's named for the ancient elephant-shaped rock that rises out of this man-made lake. Electricity from the dam's hydroelectric power plant feeds 490 miles of transmission lines and 11 substations. But it's the water from the reservoir that's turning thousands of acres of New Mexican desert green. Nurturing acres of pecan groves like these and dozens of other crops. Creating the closest thing to a breadbasket this desert state will ever know. The Rio Grande's life-giving water makes this transformation possible. But for millions of years, New Mexico has also been shaped and reshaped by a much deadlier force. Flying over the sandy floor of southeastern New Mexico's Tularosa Valley, a forbidding landscape appears. This is the Valley of Fire. 5,000 years ago, this vast expanse of rock was an ocean of molten lava, 4 miles wide in places, and up to 160 feet deep. Over millennia, the elements have ground the lava into life-giving soil that seems far richer than the desert around it. But when it came boiling out of a nearby volcano, this deadly flow devoured everything in its path and changed the landscape forever. Now, it can be eerily quiet here, proving that in New Mexico, even the most peaceful spot may hide a violent past. Even places as quiet as Valles Caldera. Today, this is one of New Mexico's most unspoiled landscapes. And like the Valley of Fire, it is teeming with life, including some of the last remnants of America's once vast herds of wild elk. These peaceful grasslands give these animals a place to breed, calve, and forage. But over 1 million years ago, 2 giant volcanoes ripped these mountains apart with a force 600 times stronger than the blast that leveled Mount St. Helens. They spewed 150 cubic miles of lava onto the land and shot out clouds of ash that fell as far away as Iowa. Then, they collapsed in gigantic implosions that punched a 175 square mile hole in the earth and left nothing behind but these peaceful meadows. Today, geologists say that there's just a 1% chance of another volcanic eruption in New Mexico within the next 100 years. But 4 miles below the Valles Caldera's floor, the magma continues to bubble. That doesn't seem to worry the elk. And it did not seem to bother Luis Maria Cabeza de Baca. Back in 1821, Baca established a ranch here that lasted until the U.S. government bought it for parkland in the year 2000. In between, the stewards of this land made sure to preserve its natural beauty. Their success brought the offer from the Park Service and caught the eye of movie producers looking to recreate the Wild West. Gregory Peck, Angelica Houston, Liam Neeson, and Pierce Brosnan are just a few of the actors who have chewed the scenery here. But the Valles Caldera isn't the only spot in New Mexico where Hollywood has come knocking. And the owners of Baca's land aren't the only New Mexicans who've rolled out the welcome mat when it did. Since first going into the movie business in 1955, Bonanza Creek Ranch has played host to dozens of film crews. Kirk Douglas, Henry Fonda, Matt Damon, Penelope Cruz, and of course, John Wayne have all worked here in this camera-ready version of the West. Stars and wannabe stars still come here to burnish their image in New Mexico's golden light. And Bonanza Creek isn't their only destination. In 1984, director Lawrence Kasdan came to New Mexico looking for the right landscape to build the realistic western town called for in his script, Silverado. He found it in a place called Cook's Ranch, home to fourth-generation Westerners Bill and Marion Cook. Before long, Kevin Kline, Scott Glenn, Kevin Costner, and Danny Glover were shooting it out in these realistic Western streets. Glover came back with Robert Duvall, Tommy Lee Jones, and the crew of Lonesome Dove. Today, Bill and Marion continue to rent out the sets and to welcome the stars, directors, and crews that have been coming and going here ever since. But there's a lot more to New Mexico's Western history than fictional gunfighters and Hollywood hype. There was a time when this really was the wild, wild West. For most of the 19th century, real cowboys and Indians waged a bitter and ultimately tragic war over this land. And few things angered the region's native peoples more than the thousands of wagons that cut these deep ruts across miles of land, bringing the first flood of American settlers to New Mexico along the famed Santa Fe Trail. The trail started on the banks of the Missouri River and headed west across the Great Plains. For over 50 years, it was the main route into New Mexico from the east, reaching all the way to Santa Fe. It was blazed in 1821 by an adventurous entrepreneur from Franklin, Missouri, named William Becknell, who was looking for new markets for his goods. By the 1840s, settlers and merchandise were streaming down the trail. These wagon ruts are all that's left. The plains of northeast New Mexico look just as they did in the early 19th century. Still today, herds of pronghorn gather here on their long annual migrations. Only found in North America, these ungulates are the fastest land animals on the continent. To outrun predators like wolves, pronghorn can reach a top speed of nearly 60 miles per hour. The biggest threats to this species today are development, coyotes, and cars. But in the 1800s, tens of thousands of pronghorn were slaughtered by travelers on the Santa Fe Trail. And pronghorn weren't the only ones threatened by the Great Migration West. As more and more settlers flooded onto this land, Apache, Navajo, Comanche, and other native peoples in New Mexico, desperate to preserve their ancient rights to the land, were determined to stem this tide. In the 1860s and 70s, their relentless attacks made the Santa Fe Trail one of the frontier's most dangerous roads. But there was a safe haven for the settlers along the way, a frontier outpost called Fort Union. Today, all that's left of the fort are these heavily eroded ruins. But in the late 1800s, this was a bustling frontier outpost. From here, the U.S. cavalry sallied out into the desert to put down native uprisings and protect the settlers' interests. Then, with the arrival of the train in New Mexico and the end of the Indian Wars in 1879, both the Santa Fe Trail and Fort Union were suddenly obsolete. The fort closed for good in 1891. Local settlers soon began scavenging bricks and wood from its walls. Time and the elements did the rest. It's hard to blame the scavengers. In these high-altitude plains, building materials can be hard to come by. And with temperatures that range from -50 to 122 degrees Fahrenheit, building the right kind of house can be a matter of life and death. Now, an eco-visionary named Michael Reynolds thinks he's figured out the best way to do it. Outside Taos, Reynolds is pioneering the development of entire subdivisions of eco-friendly homes he calls earthships. And just like the settlers near Fort Union, he's doing a lot of it with stuff he's scavenged. The load-bearing walls of these houses are built out of old tires packed with dirt, and spaces between the tires are filled in with recycled bottles and cans. Then, the walls are plastered and finished. To keep the houses as green as he can, Reynolds carefully situates them to allow passive solar heating and burrows them into the ground to keep them cool in the desert heat. Buyers can either choose a stock blueprint or work with Reynolds to create their own dream home. But no matter how whimsical the design, they are all eminently practical. According to Reynolds, his earthships cost no more than an ordinary house, making it possible for anyone to live well while leaving a light footprint on the desert land. But Earthship owners aren't the first ambitious dreamers to think they found the answer to survival in New Mexico. This state is littered with the bones of ancient cities that started big, then withered under the merciless desert sun. The remains of one of the biggest still lie scattered across the floor of the remote Chaco Canyon. Starting around the year 800, a people known as the Anasazi built a series of great houses and ceremonial centers here. Huge stone buildings overlooking broad public plazas were linked by a complex system of roads that may have stretched all the way to the Aztec Empire in what is now Mexico. Up to 5,000 people may have lived here. But even after studying these ruins for over 100 years, scientists still know very little about who the builders were, where they came from, or where they went. What they do know is that around the year 1150, these ancient people started to leave. Some say they were driven away by fierce heat and 50 drought years in a row. Others whisper of war and cannibalism. Whatever the reasons, about 100 years after the Exodus began, the last residents carefully sealed the doors of the buildings and walked away. A few of them may have ended up here, in Bandelier National Monument's Frijole Canyon, where New Mexico's next experiment in sustainable design was just taking off. As the civilization in Chaco Canyon collapsed, Pueblo people started coming here to build their homes at the bottom of the cliffs. They designed their wood, rock, and mud houses to take advantage of the cool stone and the warm sun, just as New Mexico's earthships do today. The canyon holds one of the highest concentrations of prehistoric sites in the world, including a vast ceremonial chamber perched 140 feet up the cliff. The only way to get there is by climbing 4 steep ladders. It's not for the faint-hearted, though those who lived here would have hauled water and supplies up the steep walls every day. Once inside, visitors get a unique acoustic experience. Voices echo off the walls and carry across the chamber. In the end, this community fared no better than that of Chaco Canyon. In the 1500s, famine and drought forced the residents to abandon their homes. But today, one native community is living almost exactly as they did hundreds of years ago, on the very top of this mesa. It's called Acoma Pueblo, and is the oldest continuously inhabited site in the United States. Over 800 years after the first homes were built here, the people of Acoma still survive in this harsh land, just as their ancestors did, in sturdy houses made of mud and straw bricks covered in earth. The thick walls of these dwellings keep their owners warm in the winter and cool in the summer. This building type has been used in hot, dry climates around the world for thousands of years. Today, it's often identified by the Spanish word for it, adobe. But Acoma's founders weren't just practical, they were also deeply spiritual. They may have picked this site because of the commanding view it provides of this 400-foot-high plateau across the way. It's called Enchanted Mesa. the Acoma have long revered it as the dwelling place of their gods. But when Spanish conquistadors first arrived here in 1540, native beliefs like this came under attack. Spanish missionaries were determined to impose their own religion on New Mexico's native people. In 1629, they put their new subjects to work, building Acoma's Mission San Esteban del Rey, in the style of the native adobe dwellings surrounding it. Its tall, thick walls kept the congregation cool. It was built without windows, so that the church could double as a fort. Or maybe so that reluctant converts couldn't get away. Today, it stands over Acoma as a symbol of Christian conquest, just as similar adobe-style churches loom over most Pueblo communities in the state. But the most celebrated adobe church in New Mexico isn't in a pueblo. It's San Francisco de Assisi Mission in the city of Taos. Construction of this church began in 1772 in the purest adobe style. More than 150 years later, its stark beauty inspired one of America's greatest artists to create some of her most iconic works. The great American artist Georgia O'Keeffe once said, "If you ever go to New Mexico, it will itch you for the rest of your life." O'Keeffe first came to this state in 1917 at the age of 30. From then on, she said later, "I was always trying to get back there." By the time she finally returned in 1929, O'Keeffe was an up-and-coming New York painter looking for a change of scenery and a little peace and quiet. For the next 2 decades, she came back to New Mexico almost every year. In 1949, she left New York for good and settled in this valley north of Santa Fe in a place called Ghost Ranch. From then on, the landscape around the valley was the principal subject of her art. She painted some of its landmarks over and over again. Kitchen Mesa, which looms over the north end of the ranch, was a beloved subject. But the natural landmark O'Keeffe may have loved the most was a flat-topped mountain to the south called Pedernal. "It's my private mountain," she explained. "God told me if I painted it often enough, I could have it." O'Keeffe loved many of New Mexico's human-made landmarks too. Her paintings of the bare walls and simple adobe forms of San Francisco de Assisi Mission in nearby Taos are some of her most famous works. But other New Mexicans haven't always shared O'Keeffe's enthusiasm for adobe structures. Albuquerque's San Felipe de Neri Church was built in 1793 with 5-foot-thick adobe walls. But later congregations chose to hide its Pueblo origins behind European-style architectural details. And nearby, in 1869, the adobe St. Francis Cathedral was completely torn down and rebuilt in a Romanesque revival style by a newly appointed French bishop. By the early 1900s, adobe was so out of fashion that when University of New Mexico President William Tite started redesigning campus buildings in the Pueblo manner, he set off a firestorm that cost him his job. But just a few years later, a new fad for indigenous American architecture would spark a Pueblo revival building boom. Today, Pueblo adobe-style buildings are everywhere in New Mexico. They sprawl across the once pristine landscape. The truth is, most of these houses aren't really adobe at all. Their walls are often just studs and foam insulation, slathered with painted concrete. Even now at the University of New Mexico, adobe-style architecture rules the day. Founded in 1889, its 600-acre main campus in Albuquerque is now famed for its beloved Pueblo Revival buildings. But don't let the traditional look fool you. UNM is thoroughly up to date. Many of its grads will go on to work in the city's growing high-tech sector. Others may end up working here, in northern New Mexico's Los Alamos National Laboratory. If they do, no one may ever know. This is one of the most top-secret government facilities in America. Los Alamos was founded during World War II as part of the effort to build the atomic bomb. New Mexico's vast empty spaces made this the perfect spot for keeping the effort quiet. Today, it serves as one of the U.S. government's premier national security research institutions. Its mission? To maintain the safety, security, and reliability of the nation's nuclear deterrent. Los Alamos stores thousands of pounds of plutonium, though where exactly is only known by those with high-level clearance. Yet, when most people think of top secret and New Mexico, this isn't necessarily the first place that comes to mind. That distinction may go to a desolate air base 200 miles to the southeast called Roswell. In the early days of the Cold War, Roswell was an obscure outpost of the U.S. Air Force's Strategic Air Command. Then, in 1947, a local rancher found what he claimed to be a flying saucer that had crashed on his land. The debris was brought here to the base for study. The military claimed it was just a weather balloon, but whisked it away to other bases in Texas and Ohio for further tests. When the story leaked, sensational news reports made Roswell a symbol of government conspiracies to cover up the existence of visitors from other planets. The incident sparked a UFO scare and inspired decades of science fiction movies. Then, 50 years after the incident, the Air Force released a report admitting that the wreckage was part of a secret system of atomic espionage. But for real believers, this is just another cover-up. The town of Roswell has made a cottage industry out of UFOs ever since. Thousands of the curious and the crazy come to Roswell's UFO Museum every year, drawn by the strange story of the 1947 incident, a mystery that may never be solved. But there's no mystery about the fate of most of the other aircraft that end up in Roswell. The airport is home to a private airplane salvage yard, where jets from around the world come not just to die, but to be dismembered. Once, this MD-80 ferried excited tourists and harried executives across the country. Now, it's worn out, outdated, obsolete, and headed for the scrapyard. The interior has already been stripped of its wiring and electrical components. Now, it's time to finish the job. It took thousands of hours to build this plane. Destroying it takes just minutes. One bite, rip, and crunch at a time. Once it's broken down into tiny bits, the plane's aluminum skin and other raw materials will be sold and recycled. These jets are just waiting their turn, but one will be spared destruction. This 1962 Lockheed Jetstar once belonged to a king. The king of rock and roll, that is, Elvis Presley himself. But Presley isn't the only singer who's made a big impression in New Mexico. Every summer, music lovers come here to the Santa Fe Opera House to listen to up-and-coming singers and top stars perform many of the greatest operas ever written. Some of them may take a side trip to nearby Tusuki to visit the Shidoni Sculpture Garden, an 8-acre display of modern sculpture. It's just one part of the region's thriving gallery and museum scene. But Santa Fe isn't just the center of New Mexico's cultural life. For hundreds of years, it's been the center of the state's political life as well. In 1610, King Philip III of Spain's royal governor, Pedro de Peralta, named the tiny village of Santa Fe as his capital and began construction of a home for his new administration. That building, now known as the Palace of the Governors, is the oldest government building in America. The plaza it faces remained the center of Spanish life in New Mexico until 1821, when the Mexicans threw the king's men out. Then, in the 1840s, friction between the new nation and the U.S. led to the Mexican-American War. On August 18, 1846, U.S. Army General Stephen Watts Kearny marched his troops into the plaza and raised the American flag over the palace, where it still flies today. 5 years later, Santa Fe became the capital of New Mexico Territory after Mexico ceded its former state to the U.S. in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Today, the 2,000-mile international border the treaty created remains a flashpoint for controversy and conflict. Thousands of immigrants cross illegally into New Mexico every year. Most are looking for jobs and a better life. But Mexican drug lords are helping fuel a growing cross-border trade in cocaine, heroin, marijuana, and weapons. Here, a Mexican highway lies just feet from the tall fence that now separates the United States from its southern neighbor. On the U.S. side, empty desert, and U.S. Customs and Border Protection officers working around the clock to scan for signs of illegal activity. They drag the ground on the U.S. side of the fence to make the footprints of those who cross illegally easier to track. But back in 1916, there was no one around to stop one of the most notorious border crossings in U.S. history. A raid on the town of Columbus, New Mexico, by a Mexican bandit and revolutionary named Pancho Villa. Villa's men crossed over on the night of March 9, 1916. By the time they crossed back a few hours later, Columbus was in flames. Soon, public opinion in the U.S. was too. Some say Villa was out for revenge on an American gunrunner who had cheated him. Others say he was trying to spark another war with the U.S. He almost succeeded. Even to this day, Villa's daring raid remains a great source of pride for Mexicans. And not just south of the border. After the Americans took over in New Mexico, many of its citizens of Spanish and Mexican descent continued to celebrate their heritage, their culture, and their faith. They still do today, even if they don't always honor their traditions exactly as their ancestors did. In the small northern New Mexican town of Espanola, Mexican Americans have developed their own uniquely modern way to celebrate their roots. Around here, pride comes on wheels, in beautifully customized cars. Every weekend, car-crazy Espanolans come together to show off their one-of-a-kind wheels and stake their claim to the streets. It all started with an old Mexican ritual called paseo. Caballeros would don their best clothes, decorate their saddles, and ride their finest horses slowly through the streets to assert their pride and place in the community. As early as the 1940s, cars that had been modified to ride low and slow replaced horses. But taking your time while showing off a beautiful ride is still what it's all about. Today, Espanola's lowriders are patrolling the Mexican side of a cultural divide created by a second wave of American settlers that flooded into New Mexico in the 1880s. A flood unleashed by the arrival of the train. There's nothing in the world quite like the sight of Las Vegas rising out of the western desert. Las Vegas, New Mexico, that is. Founded in 1835, 70 years before its glitzier twin in Nevada, this beautiful town is one of the state's most popular tourist attractions. But the story of its past reveals a little-known fact. Las Vegas has a split personality. Named after the area's abundant grasslands, the town started life as a Mexican village with adobe buildings around a traditional central plaza. But when the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad arrived in 1879, it turned its back on the old Mexican town by putting its tracks and station a mile to the east, where they still stand today. Soon, American settlers were pouring into the tiny red roof station looking for a place to bed down. Many made their first stop in town right next door, where Fred Harvey had built one of his trademark mission-style Harvey House hotels. The English-born Harvey was making a fortune by following the trains into the frontier and building hotels next to the stations. Harvey's inns were already gaining fame for bringing good food, clean beds, and civilization to the West. Within a few years, the new Las Vegas was booming. The Americans built it around a new square, reinforcing the divide with the Mexican community. Blocks of buildings in Victorian and Italianate styles came next. Before long, the new Plaza Hotel was giving Fred Harvey a run for his money. Teddy Roosevelt rounded up his Rough Riders here. More than a century later, the Coen brothers and Javier Bardem arrived to film scenes for No Country for Old Men. The hotel is just one of over 900 historic structures in a variety of late 19th and early 20th century styles that still stand in the new part of Las Vegas. But one of the most impressive buildings from that bygone era isn't in Las Vegas. It sits on a rocky hillside 5 miles outside of town. Today, it's called the Montezuma Castle and serves as the campus of the Arm & Hammer United World College of the American West. But in its heyday, it was the Phoenix Hotel, an elaborate resort built by the railroad in 1886 to drum up business for its trains. With its stunning main building overlooking natural hot springs, beautiful landscaped grounds, gardens with elaborate fountains, and its own spur rail line, the Phoenix seemed to have everything it needed to do the job. But the hotel closed in the 1890s when luring American tourists to New Mexico proved tougher than the railroad tycoons expected. Maybe they were just ahead of the times. Today, New Mexico is a mecca for visitors from around the world, thanks in part to the state's incredible natural beauty. But outsiders don't just come to New Mexico to see natural wonders. They come to revisit the legends and landscapes of some of the wildest parts of the wild, wild West. In the late 19th century, ranchers, rustlers, sheriffs, and gunslingers fought life-or-death battles on this land. Kit Carson, Doc Holliday, and Wyatt Earp are just a few of the legendary men who rode and fought here. Their gun battles soaked the earth in blood and marked New Mexico territory as a lawless land. Few places in the state saw more blood and less law in those years than Lincoln County, which lies in the southern half of the state. It was here, in the town of Lincoln, in the late 1870s, where a ruthless gang boss named James Dolan had an iron grip on almost all aspects of life. Local rancher John Tunstall challenged Dolan, and paid with his life. Soon, a new gang formed to continue the fight against Dolan and seek revenge for Tunstall's death. They were called the Regulators. One of the members was a young gunslinger who would become notorious as Billy the Kid. Over the next year, murder followed murder, with Billy doing his share of the killing. It would become known as the Lincoln County War. When it was over, Billy the Kid was one of the last men standing. A price was put on his head, and he lit out for New Mexico's wide-open spaces. But legendary lawman Pat Garrett tracked him down. The Kid was sentenced to hang and brought here to the Lincoln County Courthouse to await his fate. But when Garrett left town to buy wood to build a gallows, a friend slipped Billy a gun. The next day, as he was being led down the steps of the courthouse, the Kid shot his guards and made his escape. He didn't get far, just about 100 miles, before Pat Garrett finally tracked Billy the Kid down for the last time on July 14, 1881, and shot him dead. By the end of the century, the Kid's lawless frontier was dead too. On January 6, 1912, New Mexico went from territory to state, with Santa Fe continuing as the capital. Today, its bustling downtown is filled with government agencies. Its Capitol building, known as the Roundhouse, is one of the most unusual in the U.S. It was modeled after the Zia Pueblo sun sign, with 4 rays representing the 4 seasons, 4 directions, and 4 phases of life. Its occupants govern an increasingly diverse population of men and women from every corner of the world. Some of them, or their parents or grandparents, may have arrived by way of Albuquerque's Central Avenue, back when it was part of one of the hippest highways in America, Route 66. From 1926 to the late 60s, Route 66 was the main road from Chicago to LA. It was also New Mexico's main drag. Then, Interstate 40 stole its traffic and dimmed its glory. Today, the former Route 66 is getting hip all over again. Its old hotels and roadside attractions are being restored to their former luster, bringing back exciting days in the middle of the 20th century when eager adventurers roared into New Mexico by car. But in the 21st century, the real adventurers aren't coming to New Mexico to drive automobiles. They've got something in mind that's literally a lot more far out. Here, on the ancient Hornado del Muerto Plain, the state of New Mexico, billionaire Richard Branson and a group of private investors are building the world's first purpose-built commercial spaceport. If all goes as planned, spaceships will start blasting off from here very soon, taking private citizens who can afford to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars each for a trip to outer space. But even if the plans for the spaceport never get off the ground, ambitious projects like this one prove that New Mexico remains an ancient state with a big future, where dreamers still come to reach for the sky.